Thank you very much, everybody, for coming back so promptly to a packed house in the Secret Garden. Thank you for being with us all day. Those of you who have, those of you who've been here all day or been coming to talk, say we've had a lovely day. And a highlight for the last talk, Pirates of the West Cork Coast. So we're delighted to have Dr. Connie Kelleher. She's one of 3 state underwater archaeologists. She also lectures in UCC, and her research interests are pirates of the West Cork Coast, or the West Coast. So we're delighted to have her here today for the last talk of the day. Connie, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank the committee for inviting me to talk as well. And it's great to see a history conference being held with such numbers as well, so I'm glad to support it. I'm just going to give you a very, very quick overview of some of the studies I've been doing on piracy, and it combines history mainly with looking at for the evidence for the pirates as well, the archaeological evidence and the cultural evidence. So it's very slide heavy, but I'll be flying through them. There's material written on the slides. You don't need to read all the slides. I'll be talking about what's on them anyway. But and I'm glad to take questions afterwards. So I suppose piracy, when we think of piracy, I suppose we always think, lately we think about the Hollywood version of piracy and the Johnny Depps and all that, and while that kind of serves to keep the whole sense of piracy in our mind, the reality was it was different and it was the same. Some of the activities they got up to was very much the same, but the characters were very much clever, focused businessmen, and I'll illustrate that throughout the talk. Smuggling, of course, went hand in hand with piracy. If they couldn't land their goods and smuggle them ashore, then they wouldn't be pirates because they'd be stuck at sea the whole time. So piracy and smuggling go hand in hand. So that's why I'm kind of using the two together here, but really under the main heading of piracy. It was first and foremost a business. If you weren't a successful pirate, you got out of it because otherwise you'd starve. So they were in it to make money, to make a living, and to the particular piracy that I'm looking at in West Cork is very much the early part of the 17th century, which is roughly about 1603 to the 1620s. This was a heavily English-dominated piracy, with the English pirates coming over here, and I'll explain why. Now, there were multinational crews, but it was predominantly English pirates that were leading it. And it's very closely tied into the Munster plantation and the whole resettlement and the completion of the Munster plantation under James I, King James VI of Scotland and James I of Ireland. So it's that kind of surrounding context to the piracy that loomed here for that period. So it's all part of a process of expanding empires, emerging states, and that kind of thing. Just to give a very simplistic overview of what was happening, to give it a context, this was a period of change, really, in Ireland and in England. We have, at that stage, the death of Queen Elizabeth I in 1603, seen very much as a warring queen, to James VI of Scotland became James I, as I say, of England, and he joined the Three Crowns, and he liked to think of himself as the king of peace rather than the warring queen before him. So you also had a change from Tudor rule to Stuart rule. So there was all these changes going on in the heart of England and the emerging British Empire. You have the end of the 9 Years' War here and the fall of the Gaelic Lordships as well. So no longer were the main lordships and the O'Driscolls, for instance, and the O'Mahonys around here dominating the landscape. They were now subjugated to the crown, and they got their lands, many of them back by surrender and regrant, but they were now no longer lords in command. And you had the completion of the plantation of Munster and Ulster during that time as well. So you had a huge settlement and colonisation going on in the landscape. And it went from a privateering war to a pirate war as well, and I'll explain why. Obviously under Elizabeth, you had these huge explorations. You had her sea dogs, as they were known, Drake and Raleigh and all those, and she prided herself on her privateers, or private individuals or privately owned ships that went out and explored. They raided and they brought the goodies back. They didn't really settle, even though one or two of them tried to settle and develop settlements that didn't work out. And then under James, you have very much a focus on the whole idea of settlement and colonization and ships and expanding empires. So again, I kind of term it, it's transition from sea dogs to groundhogs in a way, because you have people looking to settle. King James viewed privateering, which really was the backbone of bringing money into the exchequer, along with Elizabeth really funding her navy as well. She had great pride in the whole marine aspect of her navy. James had no interest really at all, and he let the navy go into decline, and he outlawed privateering. So now it resulted in thousands of men. At any given stage, they estimate there could have been up to 50,000 men who were previously privateers or mariners, legitimate operators, now out of work, basically, and they were looking for work. So as Captain John Smith, famous Captain John Smith of Pocahontas fame, stated, this very act of outlawing privateering, men that were rich, he says, rested with what they had, so they were able to sustain themselves. Men that were poor and had nothing but had to live from hand to mouth turned to piracy, because these were mariners that knew nothing else but the sea. So they were, in a way, by default, having to turn to piracy. So this is why you get this explosion in piracy all of a sudden from James outlawing privateering. From the sources that are available on this period, there are a whole, not too many, but there are very significant ones. The High Court of Admiralty papers, in particular, in England, are extremely important and have been very much untapped. John Appleby has looked at it in greatest detail. But in some of those, you see this High Court of Admiralty one here, where it actually states that this is a confederacy of pirates. So they're beginning to notice that there's a huge expansion in piracy. State papers, proclamations, travel logs. These are the kind of manuscripts that I'm looking at and sources. There's one first-hand account by a pardoned pirate, Sir Henry Mannering. He wrote a discourse on piracy at the time. He's a famous pirate. He was an excellent captain and admiral, to such a degree that when he was pardoned, he was immediately put in charge of Dover Castle, and he became head of the navy again in 1618. So, but in thanks, as a way of showing James that he was grateful for his pardon, he wrote this discourse on piracy. And basically it's 5 chapters telling how the pirates operated, where they operated out of, how they operated, and how to defeat them, or how to kind of at least suppress them. So it's an extremely useful document to tell us exactly about what the scope of the piracy that was happening at the time. And we have another source, a source that I went to Göttingen to get a copy of, Göttingen Library, is this 1612 map specifically drawn up by the Dutch, focusing on Ireland. There's 4 maps, one main one of Ireland, and then there's 3 others, 2 of the east coast and 1 of the southwest coast. Unfortunately, there's no detailed one of the west coast, which would have been handy, but the one of the southwest coast is extremely detailed because they talk about the Roofhaven, Cape Clear. It's in Old Dutch, and it's basically the pirate havens near Cape Clear. So it's mapped specifically drawn. I call it an anti-pirate map because the Dutch drew it specifically to seek authority and a commission from James to come over and rid the harbours of the southwest of piracy, and I'll mention that later on. And they got the commission and they did come over. So that's a valuable source, particularly. I'll just quickly go back there. Sorry. Because it actually depicts the landscape. It depicts the landscape from an archaeological perspective. There's sites depicted on it, like castle sites, and from an archaeological survey perspective, you can go out and you can look for the evidence of these. Many of them are depicted, still are upstanding in the landscape, some of them aren't. So it gives us information on what was in the landscape at that stage. these are the main pirate harbours. Baltimore, Lemconskell and Crook Harbour was the main real hub of the piracy in West Cork. Even though they did travel around, they went to Dingle, they went to Kinsale, they were called into places like Youghal and Waterford. They didn't frequent the main harbours like Youghal, Cork and Kinsale because the king's ships would be harboured there, and moored there. So they tended to keep away from those rather than frequenting them. But they went all the way up to places like Blacksod Bay in Belmullet and all the way up to Lough Foyle even. There's accounts of them going all the way up there. So they did travel around the coast, but this is where they based themselves. And again, we see that Sir Arthur Chichester, the Lord Deputy, in 1608 states clearly that of all the harbours in Munster, they're very commodious and safe for pirates to come into, yet Baltimore is the one that they most frequent. So it's stated clearly there. Just to say quickly about the Gaelic Lordships, they didn't go away, they were still there, and lordships like the O'Driscolls were very much a maritime lordship. They had their own fleets of ships. They're depicted on the Seal of Waterford because they were captured by the men of Waterford. There was a feud going on there for centuries, and but they were known for their galleys and their ships. So they were a maritime lordship themselves and a warring lordships, and they were very much kind of a mercenary lordship. When the need arose, they would go out and fight for others. So they very much would have been tied into anything like the piracy that was going on there, and they would have served two masters. At times there's accounts of them arresting pirates, and then other times liaising with the pirates. So this was, rather than it being a new pirate base, I like to think of it as a continuity, but a changed way of it being a pirate base. And of course, officials started to come in, and different agents and private speculators, not least Richard Boyle himself. And I know David Edwards was talking about Richard Boyle earlier. An amazing man, a clever man, one of the wealthiest men in the country at the time, or eventually. And he was very clever in the sense that he always kept a distance between himself and the pirates. And I'm still trying to find a direct link, but he had middlemen so that he was above reproach, as it were. He sent his cousin, Lawrence Parsons, down to deal with local issues in West Cork. And he, in turn, brought William Hull into the scene. And again, William Hull became the real pirates broker in West Cork. And he married into the Boyle family. So there's these huge interchanges and interlinks between individuals who are here. Others, Humphrey Jobson and Richard Jobson, two brothers, came over here. But they didn't come over here on spec. They all knew each other and they knew the landscape before they arrived. And that's because in the southwest coast of England was the real pirate harbours. And when James basically shut down the ports in England, when he outlawed privateering and he tried to eradicate pirates over there, they shifted their base of operations to the southwest coast of Ireland. And this is attested to by Hawkins when he states clearly that James's actions was instrumental in their locating to the southern coast of Ireland. So that's how they came over here. But they would have been sailing over here through time, and they would have been familiar with it. So that's why they came to Ireland. It was close by, they were familiar with it. It was the same type of landscape that they were used to, and landscape is all important to the pirate operation. And they would have been familiar with a lot of the areas and a lot of the people over here. And you had, like at the southwest coast of England, you had a willing and eager populace, local populace, to deal with them, which was all important. There was also a loophole in the law here, which meant that you couldn't be tried for piracy over here. You had to be extradited to England to be put on trial. So that means that they could, in a way, had a free rein. And this is, again, Arthur Chichester states that there's no laws here, he says. What shall be done about the pirates here in prison, for we have no law to hang them. And he's asking the Central Admiralty in London, see what can be done about that. This was a time as well where, as I say, there's expansion of empires. There's the main maritime empires of Europe are vying for the Atlantic. The Dutch and the English are desperately trying to break the back of the Iberian control on seafaring. You have these huge ships going out and coming back with goods, highly valued goods. And then you see an advent of more fleeter ships and smaller ships being built to facilitate increased trade and faster trade. And it's these ships that were hugely useful to the pirates because they could use them and they could attack the larger ships, the merchantmen, easier. And the wealth of nations now was in the belly of ships going and coming, and they were easy picking and they were expanding all the time, and therefore it was an incentive for piracy to grow as well. And rather than being on the periphery, as it was thought, even in historical studies up to recently, Ireland was very much strategically placed at that stage. If you see here with all the goods manufacturers going back and forth, goods going out to supply the colonies, and then exotic goods coming back. And with the pirates located now on the southern coast of England, they were perfectly placed to actually intercept those ships going to and coming from those areas. But those in Ireland were also themselves used to going across the Atlantic. It wasn't that suddenly this was a revelation. We had been in the Amazon from the 1550s onwards, for instance, with settlements there. And of course, Montserrat is a famous one where it's called the Emerald Isle of the Caribbean, where they have celebrate St. Paddy's there. They're known as the Black Irish. They celebrate Paddy's there. They're there every year. So quite an influence even since that time. So travelling across the seas at that stage, that was the roadways or the routeways. So it wasn't such an onerous task as we believe it to be. You can't see this very well, but this is just during this time after 1570 as well. Another key change, Elizabeth was excommunicated by Pius V in an attempt to isolate her from the Catholic states and the Catholic empires and the growing maritime empires. And she in turn decided to align herself with the Islamic world. And you can see here the Ottoman Empire in the northern part of Africa, and the separate Moroccan sultanates on the northwest of Africa. And she aligned herself with those, and trade began from the 1570s on, and communication began. And this again is strategic to the pirates' operations. And even when you look at early maps of Algiers, even from the middle of the 1500s, these were vibrant cities, fortified cities, rich cities, very wealthy cities. So to align yourself with that kind of a power meant that your trade was still continuing. And considering what's happening in Britain today, it could be construed as the first maybe Brexit at the time, or exit. Britain wasn't coined at the time, but there's fantastic accounts of Muhammad al-Nouri, the Moroccan ambassador at the time in 1600, with his long robes walking through the streets of London and people being fascinated by him. So rather than being strangers, these people were communicating with each other. And as a result, the pirates set up another base, a winter base in Mamora, which is now Mehdia, on the northwest coast of Africa in the Moroccan Sultanate area. They were free ports. They hadn't been taken over by the Ottoman Turks yet, so they were able to freely trade with those. And it was Henry Mannering that set up his headquarters here. As you can see, another castellated fort overlooking the River Cebu out to the open sea. Pirates would pay a stipend to the sultans, and then they could freely trade with the desert traders and bring their own goods in. So it was an open, an entrepot or a free port that they could trade with. So suddenly you have a fairly strategic base in Ireland, and now you have another strategic base in Northwest Africa. And the third strategic base they had was in Newfoundland. And as the name suggests, it was newly found and newly beginning to grow. There was migratory fishermen there from about the 1570s, but from the early 1600s, the whole colonies began to form in Newfoundland. Harbour Grace to start with, John Guy, and Ferrybank after that. And the pirates set up their other base there. So again, you see all these developing communications in areas. And when you join them up in a triangular route you can then see how the pirate hunting ground had the northern part of the Atlantic completely sewn up. They could catch any ship coming or going, including in and out of the Mediterranean and the Levant, and such was their success that eventually, and I'll get to that, they were more or less nearly all, the main ones were nearly all pardoned. So this triangular hunting ground was the main part of their strategy. And it was very much a business, as I say, a multicultural business. Roger Middleton, who was tasked eventually by James to go over and start negotiating pardons with them because they were so strong, there were so many of them there. At any given time, there could have been 1,000 pirates operative off our coast. Roger Middleton was sent over to be the arbiter in pardons with the main leaders, the main captains. And he wrote back to the Admiralty, to Salisbury, and he said, "That which passeth here in Munster is reals of 8, Barbary ducats and dollars. And it is thought, of course, that the pirates have buried their treasure on land." So typical pirates is kind of this usual kind of Hollywood idea of pirates burying their treasure. But you get a sense of the whole cosmopolitan nature of the southwest coast of Cork at that stage with the volume of traffic coming and going. In order, though, to have a good business, you have to have some form of command system and some form of management system. And they did. They had a pirate hierarchy and elected their leaders. Richard Bishop became their admiral. He was elected in and about 1608, 1609. He was a very learned man by all accounts. He was literary. He could sign his own name. You can see it over here where his name is signed, Richard Bishop. And he had been a privateer under Elizabeth's in Elizabeth's time. So he would have known the coast. He would have known the people involved. And it's strategic that he was elected the admiral because he became the middleman for the pirates, and he was the one who was put forward to negotiate with Roger Middleton. So the thought process behind this was very clever. They had a learned member of their community leading them, basically. He seems to have settled in Lemcon when he was pardoned, and in 1617 he's noted as an old pardoned pirate that lives suspiciously near Lemcon, ever plotting with and relieving other pirates. So he didn't give up. Because it states in the sources that he built a house in the English fashion in Lemcon. Again, it's where the map is handy. It shows some settlements in Lemcon, but we don't know where his house would have been. It could have been anywhere. But again, it suggested that there could be archaeological evidence there. Peter Easton, running through this, he became their vice admiral, and he became probably the most successful, and it's because of his attacks and the amount of damage he was doing to shipping, particularly to the Dutch and the French, that James decided we'll have to think about pardoning these. So it was really his actions. Unlike the others, Mannering, Richard Bishop, and Thomas Frank, to a sense, they had adopted a code amongst themselves, a pirate code, because they had all been privateers. They wanted to remain honourable, as they saw it, and they refused to attack their own ships. So they would not attack an English ship. They would only attack the ships of the traditional enemies of the crown. And as a result, that's probably why they were given pardons so quickly. Peter Easton, on the other hand, decided he wasn't going to have any go to practice, and he attacked who he wanted to, and hence why he was so successful and he caused so much damage. He set up his headquarters in Newfoundland, in Harbour Grace, and he built himself a fortification there on Kelly's Island. So obviously named after an Irish person, in Harbour Grace Bay. He never accepted a pardon. He went on, and I'll explain, to live under the Duchy of Savoy. But again, he would have been now strategically placed over there. You had Mannering in Northwest Africa, and you had Bishop in Southwest Cork. In Harbour Grace, there is some archaeological evidence. There's a pirate graveyard where 47 of the pirates are buried, and they also have, through excavations in Ferryland, found Irish silver pennies and things like that. Now that's not to say that the Irish silver penny is pirate trading goods or from pirate activity. It could be from the colonies as well, or the colonial time. So we have to be careful we don't start boxing things. And Thomas Frank, we know the least about him. He became Rear Admiral. So you have an Admiral, Vice Admiral, Rear Admiral as a hierarchy, and then all the other captains underneath. Again, he's serving in a 200-ton boat, 20 guns, and 100 men, for instance, at that stage as well. He ended up going off with Easton for a lot of his predations, and then eventually through David Heffernan's, Dr. David Heffernan's and Dr. Edwards' work, that they're looking at Boyle's estates and who settled on them and how they were divvied out. David thinks he's found a reference to a Thomas Frank eventually settling after he was pardoned in Clonakilty, in a house curiously owned by Richard Boyle in 1631. So I'm putting up just some of the Admiralty papers where the pirates are actually mentioned in them. And we do have a list of captains, so it does get kind of easier when you actually find a source where they list the captains, and they list the main captains here, Captain Frank, and it goes on to name his other captains, Suxbridge, and the like. So every main captain had his own captains, and then they had their own ships. So for every main captain, like Rear Admiral Frank, they would have had 3 or 4 captains serving under them, and they in turn would have their own ships. So you begin to get the scale in your head of what was going on. And just from looking at the main captains, not even the lesser captains, I've identified at least 71 primary captains, and there's some of their ships there associated with them: the Blessing, the Concord, the Fortune, the Flying Cow. They all had different names. So if you start adding 3 or 4 individual captains to each one, and then 3 or 4 or 5 ships to that, and within each ship they could have anything from 60 to 100 men, you begin to see how many people were involved in piracy. And this was democratic. This is contrary to what some people think, that pirates were just out for themselves. They had to have a democratic setup where they each had shares according to your status, and that was divvied out. And again, the High Court of Admiralty papers belonging to 226 deals with actually pirates who were executed in Youghal in 1613, I think. It talks about how they shared out their goods, so we can go through that. And when you start thinking about the goods, obviously with pirates, we always think of treasure, and we think of gold doubloons or silver reels of 8, Spanish reels of 8, or diamonds or rubies or whatever. And while this was the case, it wasn't just about silver and gold. It was about the spice trade and the sugar trade. And in fact, this was far more lucrative: cinnamon and sugar cane, sugar cane from places like Barbados. The condiments: nutmeg, vanilla, cloves, and the prize of all prizes, pepper, which was known as black gold at the time. And this was so valuable that it came in. It came in ton loads. More mundane goods then were valuable to the local populace, because they in turn traded with the pirates, and they sent out their goods. So they'd be supplying the ships with hides, or beeves as they were called, dried fish for food, wine and beer, hogshead of beer, tallow for wax, and salt, of course. And for the pirates deal with the locals, and this is why you had so many willing locals, is that the locals got paid 3 times the normal value for their goods than they would on the legitimate market. So it paid the locals to actually deal with the pirates. So this is the kind of circular trade that went on. And just to give you a kind of a flavour, if you'll excuse the pun, of these, how valuable these things were. John Jennings, one of the main pirate captains again, when he came in to West Cork in a 300-ton ship, he had on it 150 chests of sugar, 36 cases of cinnamon, 12 packs of pepper, a personal chest of pearls, diamonds, silver, clothes quilted with Barbary gold, worth between £400 and £500, £40 worth of doubloons, clusters of diamonds and rubies, and miscellaneous booty to the value of £2,000. So that was an enormous sum. So these were huge sums coming in just one ship. So it's no wonder people were waiting on the shore for it. Again, Captain William Bowe, 1612, he brought in 150, 25 tons of fustic, 6 bags of cottonwood, guinea pepper, again, you see pepper throughout it all, cotton yarn, glasses, wooden bows, 17 compasses. So you start looking at the cargoes on these ships and seeing what was being traded. And aniseed. Aniseed was first brought in 1578 by Thomas Cavendish following his explorations to the Philippines. So you see this ongoing trade in these exotic goods. And Captain William Bowe was very much associated with Castle Park in Kinsale. Henry Skipwith was the Vice Admiral there. And he used to bring silver and gifts to Skipwith's wife because he wanted to marry their daughter. So that's what he was doing around there. But then if you dig a little deeper into where these condiments and these goods were coming from, you begin to get an idea of where these ships were travelling to and from. Pepper from the Indian Ocean and the South China Seas, places like the Malaccas, Malaysia and Borneo. More coming in from Ceylon, cinnamon from Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, vanilla from Mexico, Madagascar and Indonesia. Nutmeg, again from Indonesia and the Spice Islands. Cloves from Indonesia, Malay, Zanzibar, Sri Lanka, Pakistan and Tanzania. Sugarcane from Jamaica and Barbados. Wine from the continent. Silk from China. And salt from places like the northern Adriatic and the salt roads from the deserts of Africa, which again explains why they were so keen to trade with the North Africans. And if you consider even, why are condiments currency? You look back at the meaning of the word spice. We use the word species to denote something of value, and it comes from the word spice. Pepper. Pepper was traded like money. When the King of Spain, Philip II, ran out of money, he paid his exchequer accounts in pepper, for instance, and it was accepted. And a man's wealth would be, dowries could be paid in pepper, for instance. And even the first Trinity Church in Manhattan was actually built by a yearly rent was attributed to it with 1 peppercorn, and it became known as the peppercorn tax. And later on, the famous pirate William the Kid was associated with the building of the Trinity Church because he used his ship's tackle to build the church. So there's a pirate link to the Trinity Church in Manhattan. And again, nutmeg and cloves in the 17th century, these were actually more valuable than pepper, but there was more pepper traded. So in the 17th century, the records have it that cinnamon and cloves were worth about £1 million, while the trade in pepper was worth between 6 to 8 million. I mean, even in today's standards, if you were making 6 to 8 million on pepper, you'd be doing well. Back then, it was an absolute fortune. And just finally, the word salt, salary comes from the word salt. So you see all these value kind of connotations attached to these spices and things. Central to it all, William Hull, a Devon mariner. He was indicted for piracy on a number of occasions. His father was mayor of Exeter, so he got off. He officially moved, even though he was here beforehand, to West Cork in 1608. He was Vice Admiral. And he leased the lands from the O'Mahanys down in West Cork. And it was strategic. When you think about some of the settlements that went on, he never developed a settlement there. He had his domain, but even though it can't be proven, I would imagine that was deliberate because he didn't want to attract attention by having loads of settlers. He wanted to remain incognito because he really was the pirate broker. And he was noted as a notorious harbourer of pirates and a receiver of their goods. So he was, and we have archaeology there. We know he built his own castle, kind of castellated house, or fortified house. We have the O'Mahony Castle there in Castle Point that he also used. And again, both of them are depicted on the Dutch 1612 Dutch map. So archaeologically, again, we have a representation of those. So, and as I say, he did marry into the Boyles as well. He married Richard Boyle's brother's widow, I think. So it was very convoluted. Thomas Crook, as we know in Baltimore, and Bernie McCarthy has certainly written the book on him. From Dunashad, he built his, he basically had his administrative centre in what is now Dunashade Castle. There was an O'Driscoll Castle attached to it that was, we feel, must have been knocked at some stage. Again, on the map and archaeologically, you see the O'Driscoll Tower House represented, and then you see the extended fortified house that Thomas Crook built. And again, we have no other evidence for the castle, so it's amazing. Some of these charts are hugely valuable from a cultural perspective. And again, he leased the lands from Fineen O'Driscoll when he was there. Very much, again, tied in to the pirates. In fact, he was dragged over to London at one stage to answer for why he was dealing with pirates, and he was going to be indicted for it. But the Crown decided that his settlement in Baltimore that he had developed was so valuable to the Crown that he was more valuable being left in Baltimore. So he was sent home, back here. And I just put in James Salmon because he's close by, or was close by. He was based eventually in Castlehaven as Vice Admiral here, but he served in Baltimore working out of Old Court Castle, down on the map as Court, and he held the Admiralty Court there. But funnily enough, he was son-in-law of Thomas Crook, so they're all connected here. And he comes into his own later on to do with privateering and Spanish galleons and things like that as well in Castlehaven. So you have all this going on, but unless you can land your goods, it's no good to you. So where to land? Well, we know from 1625, this first-hand account, that Klaus Campaign, one of the famous Dutch pirates, probably one of the most famous, landed his goods in Lemcon. We even have a signed form there. He was openly dealing with William Hall, and we even have a list of his goods. And we have a list of the men, the names of the people. William Hall is listed there. Thomas Neal of Bandon Bridge. Bandon figures hugely here. Jeremy Roston, the Whites of Cork, probably of Bantry. And you have Nicholas Aswood. You have all these waiting with carriers, as they're called, so they have men in carts waiting on the quaysides to collect Klaus Campaign's goods when they come in. So again, there must have been a network of communication in place because they knew the ships were coming in. And Campaign unloaded all his goods and they were carried away immediately to Cork. In fact, it says here, Sir William Hull sent 40 horse loads of pepper to Kinsale. So they were going probably to Skipwith and Kinsale. We know as well, just an aside, at the time that Campaign had a prize. He had captured a ship and he brought it in and it sank in Skull, and I'll say a bit more about that in a second. So we have first-hand accounts. So where were they coming into? What was there that allowed them to land these goods? Because if you look at the maps of, we have some archaeology on the land in Lemcon, but that's it. So part of my studies was to go down and start looking in the water and at low water. And lo and behold, at Lemcon, you get all these remains of quays, old quays, the long dock, basal remains of another quay, quay steps, 2 or 3 sets of them, stone features in the water, mooring posts just down beyond the house, and a small boat harbour as well. So you suddenly, these are all now robbed out, or they've washed away over the years. But there was obviously fairly substantial infrastructure in place for the pirates to come in. So it's building up a picture of this. Now, Hull made most of his fortune from fishing, so a lot of this would have been to facilitate the legitimate trade of fishing and his fish palaces and things like that too. So again, it wouldn't have all been for piracy, but it certainly would have allowed them to land their goods. We know from the depositions in 1641, when Hull was booted out of his house, that he had cellars where he kept his goods, and cellars were a very commonplace way of hiding your smuggled goods. This is a beautiful one in Muckra's house, just in Dunmore outside Clonakilty. It's now turned into a children's playroom. But there's a murder hole overhead in the roof of it, where if you were raided, you could you'd strategically try to get the Admiralty officer to stand under the hole and you drop a stone on him, basically. It's probably to facilitate goods going up and down too. But there's almost an identical one in Savannah in Georgia. So these weren't just isolated sites. They were put in deliberately. And again, a smuggler's tunnel that leads up into the inside of a house, just recently found there in the UK in Hastings. So it's just really trying to find and identify these sites. So it's looking at them from the idea of a pirate landscape. What does it mean to have a pirate landscape? Within it, you're looking at settlement and industry, the illicit activity that went on there, also the legitimate trade, because these men were seasonal. They had seasonal piracy, and during the winter, if they chose to stay here, they could work as fishermen or whatever, or work in some local trade. Looking at wrecks associated with them, and then looking for infrastructure. Looking at other sites that allowed them access to the coast, as I call them, coastal access points for a better term. They allowed people access to those on the sea, and they allowed those on the sea access to the coast. And here's a whole series of rock-cut steps and rock-cut platforms and roadways. This is in Dingle, in Slovene and Dingle. But you see all these lovely steps coming down in Ardgroom Pirate Associated Cave, another one in Glandore. And you have all these lovely steps going down. Of course, Canty's Cove over by Dunmanus, a famous one. And he was a pirate, not a very honourable one, but he was a pirate as well. And these are beautiful pictures of them down in Dunmore East, a whole series of them in Badger Cove, about 5 or 6 different types. Dunmore East, Credden Head, known as the Boher na Mná Gurram, which has associations with slavery, the Road of the Black Woman or the Blue Women, possibly denoting slavery. On the Saltees, of course, and then this other Dunmore East. So you have all these steps, and there's more all around the country. And this is just my friend Anya Brosnan just sent this on to me from Ardnagashel. So again, they're turning up everywhere. Next time you go to a rocky shore and you get a whiff that boats might have come in, I bet you'll find a set of steps. Word of caution, and this is where archaeologists have to be careful as well, that we don't overly box these things, that we don't say, oh, they must be pirate steps or they must be smuggler steps. They could be that, but they would have had a multiple usage. A lot of them are associated with fresh water sources. There's streams or there's wells or there's springs. So they would have been ways of mariners to have fresh water on board. So you can overthink this too sometimes. So we have to be careful that we don't overthink it. Of course, the problem with stone steps and stone formations is you can't date them readily, so you don't know what period they date to either. Some of them, however, are pretty self-explanatory. These two, one on Sleek Head, Gokane Point down in Crookhaven, have to be smuggler steps, or because only a mad smuggler would put them where they are. They're literally wide enough for one person to get down. They overhang the sea down here. You see them here. There's about, I don't know, 100-foot drop or maybe 60-foot drop, and then there's a cavern underneath that you could bring in your little boat. So they must have used a winch and a davit to bring goods up and down, and at that stage. And why? I think they're probably in use earlier than the 17th or the 18th century, is because the Coast Guard station was built eventually over here, where you can look across and keep an eye on what's going on the headland. So that kind of gives a hint at how they're earlier than that. The most beautiful one that Thomas Somerville from Droshan, I don't know if he's here, but he drew my attention to it, is on his lands just down Castlehaven. Whole series of steps in Dutchman's Cove. But what's unique about this so far, anyway, I haven't found any parallel sites, is that overhead they've got 2 lantern niches, and if you put your lamps in there, they guide the small ship's boats in to land your goods. So again, I've done a lot of searches, haven't come across a parallel. There must be other ones there. Half the time we're too busy looking down, so sometimes we should look up as well. So beautiful 2 lantern niches. And speaking of boats, if you didn't have a boat, you couldn't really be a pirate. So what kind of boats did they have? And what's the evidence for those? And again, I'll just be very quick on this. They had to have fleet ships, and they were known to have these Dutch flutes, as they were called, because they were medium-sized ships. They carried about 20 or 30 guns. Some of them were bigger. But in our shipwreck inventory, as part of my job in the State Underwater Unit, we're listing all the shipwrecks we can find records of or referenced to for the country. We're up to about 18,000 at this stage. But 12 of those are associated with pirate ships in West Cork. That's just the records of those. They're not specific locations. But these were very manoeuvrable, and that was part of the success of the pirates, that they could weave in and out of the islands of Roaring Water Bay and the king's ships couldn't. They were too big. So that's why they chose places like this that they could find. There was what was called choking points. They could go in around islands, and it was a choke point. The king's ships couldn't get in there. So they thought very clearly about the landscape they chose. Brian Martin showed me this site, and I think Mary has done her study on it. The careening site down in very little known about careening sites. They're mentioned a lot in the books. You have to be able to clean the bottom of your ship. So that's when you're most vulnerable. You bring them in, you turn it on one side, then clean off all the gunk, turn it on the other side, clean it. So you're up on shore for a certain amount of time, tidal dependent, and that's when you're most vulnerable. So they looked for areas where they could careen their ships in suitable areas, and it's mapping these sites. What you have here is a lovely set of rock cut holes and fissures, deliberately cut where they could tie their ropes, put in their planks and lean their ship up against it. And it was, again, Brian Martin that drew my attention to that. So it's looking out for this as well in the landscape. And there is references to ships being careened in the cove area of Baltimore. Here's one wreck that might be associated. I mentioned earlier Klaus Campaign lost his ship in Lemcon. A colleague of mine, Juliana O'Donoghue of Mizzen Archaeology, was doing work down in Skull for the main drainage there, and she was monitoring, and she came across a shipwreck. They hit a shipwreck. The artifacts on it date to the early 1620s, so the time period is right. Lovely Spanish olive jars, blocks, tackle. What's unique about it is there's carrying a cargo of coconuts. There's only 5 wrecks in the world so far that had coconuts on them, and this is the only wreck so far that the coconuts have a plantation mark, so it's a very important wreck. It's a very intact wreck too. It's the lower hold is intact, and you can look down. It's in about 12-13 meters. You can look down, and down under in the hold of it, there's boxes, crates or whatever. So she opened one of them, there wasn't anything in it. Now if it was sugar or whatever, it would probably dissolve, or else they had offloaded whatever they had and they were empty. But it's an amazing wreck, and it does date properly. Now she has to do a lot more work on it. And again, Klaus Campaign's ship lost there in the 1625s. We have another one, and I think this highlights, I'll move quickly on, local peoples kind of not putting up with too much hassle from pirates either. They had to play ball. Pirate John Nutt, famous pirate in the 1620s, he took a prize and he brought it into Ballinaskelligs, which was one of his haunts. The goods were carried to Bearhaven. The ship went to Bearhaven, and it sank to its bilges. A William Bond recovered the goods from it in it, which was included sugar, and he was classed as a pretend pirate, for whatever that meant in the sources. And he landed the goods at Bearhaven, and then went on to Bantry with the goods. But most of the sugar, it says, was purloined by the country people there, various poor and desperate people living in rough and remote places. So the people basically saw these goods coming in and they said, well, we're going to have that. So sometimes you go to all that effort and nothing. Nutt is associated with the infamous raid on Baltimore, himself and his brother Robert Nutt. And they attacked. This was a change in piracy. Piracy I'm interested in goes into the demise in and about 1613-14. This is later piracy when human cargo was part of the lure, the white slavery, and you have a dominance of the Ottoman Turks now taking over. John and Robert Nutt sailed as captains under the Ottomans, and they were the ones who came in and raided. They lost one ship in Dunmorley Bay. Robert Nutt is recorded as losing one of his ships prior to that raid when they were on their way. Interestingly, John Nutt, his brother, was very closely linked with Calvert, who had set up the colony in Newfoundland. So again, you see these continuing links with colonial speculators, and it makes you see that, you know, all these guys knew others that kept them going. The Rover, or the Black Mary, is reputedly the name of the ship that was lost in Dunmorley Bay, probably the Black Mary. I would imagine the Dutch called it a rover, meaning a roofer, meaning a pirate. And in 2004 we did work on a wreck down there dating to the right period, and certainly trade beads have washed in from it, in from the shore there, possibly associated with a slave ship that went down there as well. But again, the wreck that we're dealing with here, you see the cannons from it, date to the 1620s, 1630s. So it could again be associated with that. It's very hard to actually say what is a pirate ship, because no ship was really built to be a pirate ship. You couldn't say, I think I'll have a pirate ship today. They became pirate ships, and then they could have gone back to being merchant ships again. So it's very hard to actually definitively say what a pirate ship is, unless you're lucky enough to find the Widda where you have a bell with the Widda written on it. So we don't. From the guns that have come up from it, it does give a date into the 1630s. So it is the right date at least. And very quickly, to finish off, hand in hand with all of that came prostitution and drink, of course, with pirates. But again, this was all part of the settlement that was going on. When they settled, the pirates brought their families as well, their wives, their sisters, their children. And it became a business. The men could be at sea for 18 months. Some went away for 3 years. So the women had to sustain. There was a way, and it was actually came back through the Admiralty officials that there was an agreement that the pirates sent money back for their wives and their families, and it was distributed through the Admiralty officers. And there's accounts of women beating up Admiralty officers because they didn't get their share that was sent back. But we have direct references to prostitution in southwest Cork. A pirate named Gibbs, for instance, in his bark in Baltimore, sailed away, and I'm quoting verbatim, carried away, so I apologise to the children, I carried away with him 2 or 3 of his pirates and some of his whores, about 5 in number. And again, pirate Nicholas Thompson in 1616 was reported to be very ill from the burning of the whores. Now, whether he was physically burnt because he was unruly, or whether they're referring to some sexually transmitted disease, probably the latter. And sometimes you get these curious references. This is one from 1620. Debauchery, again, seems to have been part and parcel. Of course, drink was involved. So debauchery during pirates' downtime, with one account reporting that when fighting amongst themselves, they usually hit one another in the teeth with their whores, whatever that means. But again, Henry Mannering's account states clearly the connection between the business of prostitution and alehouses. We had a change from when the Gaelic lords went into decline after 1601. It changed fundamentally to this whole concept of feasting, where you brought people into your manor or your house or your castle, and you sat them down at your table and you feasted. Now, the whole idea of entertainment went outside. You had inns and you had alehouses and taverns. So you went outside now. So it's a whole different way of entertaining, and very much harder to control. A lot of the inns were family homesteads. So you'd have, like here, you'd have the inn on one side and you'd have the family homestead on the other side. Similarly, a lot of the brothels were run out of inns. So while you might have a legitimate tavern, you could also have a brothel being run. So archaeologically, it's very hard to find the evidence. The Shebeen pub down in Baltimore is probably in an area where the earliest pub, one of the earliest pubs, it's not in the location where the Shebeen is, but it's just up the road. So again, the whole name Shebeen could hark back to the fact that it was an illicit pub there at one stage. And Mannering himself says they have good store of English, Scottish and Irish wenches which resort unto them. And these are strong attractors to draw the common sort of them hither. And again, Morris, in the council book of Munster, a growth in illegal alehouses and taverns went hand in hand with the growth in prostitution, because they state the continuing relief of pirates that pirates have received from time to time in the western parts by such shameless and adulterous women as daily resort unto them, and especially by means of various taverns. So you see this entertainment going on. There is evidence from the 19th century in places like Washington for from brothels, and they can even find a hierarchy of command within them between the different women who worked there. And from an earlier period, the 1500s, there's a pauper's graveyard for prostitutes in London, Crossbones it's called, Crossbones Graveyard. And such was and again, this is in London, so we're talking about urban centres where we can find some semblance of evidence where pirates are secret, the women in their lives are even more secret and invisible. So it's trying to, again, to build up a picture of these women. Such was their plight that John Stowe survey, the local vicar took pity on them, and because they were doing what they did, they were not allowed to be buried in the Christian graveyard. So he set up a graveyard for him. And just to give you an idea of the kind of life that some of these women had, this is a skeleton of an 18 to 25-year-old prostitute. She suffered in life. Her teeth were rotten and malformed. She suffered from syphilis. Such was the extent of it that it had attacked her skull, and she would have had open sores on her head. And she also suffered from rickets. And this is in an urban centre. So a very, very poor, hard life for a lot of them. Some of the evidence you can get, the point I was making about the urban is it's almost impossible to find evidence in the rural setting for this, because first of all, you don't know where the taverns were, and if there was there, you don't know where their houses were, so to find evidence of the even more invisible women in the lives is even more impossible. You can find it again in cities or towns by looking at street names and laneway names, and again, I'll just put these up here. I won't read some of them out, but if you look at this, we're in North Yorkshire, Ticklecock Bridge, for instance, where the red light district was. I won't, you'll make that out yourself. So some of these you can track on the old maps, and you can see that some of them were very near the ports, and you can start finding out where these women operated and get a link to it that way, and start trying to build a picture of life on the streets and life as a pirates and waiting to come in, and the women in the life. Now, again, even in America, Whorehouse Meadow or Pleasure House Creek, again, harks back. But there's no evidence there, but at least you've got the place name. Another word of warning, we shouldn't really overthink this either, because sometimes a name is just a name and there's nothing more in the name than the name. And it's so obvious, you kind of try thinking that maybe it means something else. It doesn't. This place in Cornwall, it's so narrow that if somebody's in front of you, you're literally kissing their ass. So we can't overthink it either. So it went into decline. My last two slides. Why did it go into decline? A few reasons. The Act for suppressing pirates changed in 1613. It came into operation in 1614. Pirates could now be tried and hanged in Ireland. So they were no longer safe here, and they didn't have to be taken to London to be tried. Mamora, their main base in North Africa, Northwest Africa, was captured by the Spanish. So suddenly their main base over there fell, and they didn't have a winter ground or a winter base. The Dutch came in. They drew the map in 1612 and in 1614. They had their commission from James, and they were just supposed to come in and arrest the pirates. But if you notice on the map, every other harbour it's decorative, it's got detail, but this is the only harbour, Crookhaven, where it's got the depths written on it. So it has a depth gauge as well there. And in 1614 they came in and they decimated Crookhaven, killed Patrick Maya, the pirate there, and his two sons. They killed about 30 ordinary settlers. They burnt the place, they burnt the ships, and they wiped out the pirate colony there. And that sent shockwaves through the place. So Moy Lambert was the captain who did that. So they were vicious when they came in. James went mad because they were only supposed to, and the English Crown and the Admiralty went mad because they went far and beyond the brief of their commission. But that struck a serious blow. So James was forced into action, and he offered pardons at that stage. And that's why a lot of the piracy that is English dominated, you now see them settling. And we know lots of them settled. William Harvey built a house in Lemcon. It's all in Lemcon. William Bow, he didn't. He went to Inishannon. He settled there. up on the Bandon River, and he ended up actually dying in a debtor's prison, probably in Bandon. Edward Jolliffe, he ended up living openly in Lemcon. Richard Robinson moved to Lemcon. William Thompson was settled in Lemcon, and he also went to Sherkin and served on duty there. Again, Cade settled at Lemcon, and he became a Vice Admiral to Humphrey Johnson. So they all started getting legitimate jobs. John Jennings, the pirate, was actually executed. And Arthur Drake, recorded as one of the only Negroes or black pirates who held a position. He was a lieutenant with the Pirate Confederacy, and he was in Lemcon. He didn't settle there, but he was with Jennings when they handed themselves up, so we don't know what happened to him. Their leaders, Richard Bishop, settled in Lemcon. It looks like possibly Frank settled in Clonakilty. Peter Easton went off, didn't take a pardon. He went off to the Duchy of Savoy, which is now in France, but was an independent state at the time. He became a Marquis, or Marquess, and he lived out his life as a rich man. We have a Roger Salter. I said I'd put him in here, seeing that we're so close to Castlehaven. Came in. When he comes in, there's an account of it, and when he was pardoned, he lived on Ringaroga Island. Others settled as fishermen in Crookhaven, and then others, when Charles I, when James died, Charles I came on and took the throne after 1625. He made privateering legal again. So you have the pirates who were privateers now going back to actually being legitimate mariners again, like Walsingham, Parker and Stevens and those. And they went on to have a long life of privateering. 26, as I said, were hanged, and then the rest of them simply disappear, and we don't know where they are. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Connie for a very enlightening lecture on piracy on the West. And we've got so much to look for now every time we go for a walk by the seaside.
Find me steps.
So everybody's to applaud steps. We ran over a little, so maybe we time for one question. We have one question.
You said that you touched on Irish involvement. Could you say a little bit more about them, and particularly about the O'Driscolls?
The O'Driscolls, well, at the time during this piracy, they were still serving there. The Finian O'Driscoll was an admiral. He had admiralty duties down in Kinsale, but he was also in Baltimore working hand in hand with the pirates. So he was again serving two masters. The last, I think 1629 is when we have the last kind of official record of an O'Driscoll living in his castle in Lochine, I think. But after that, really, they went into a complete demise. But they were still there as serving the Admiralty when in and about from 1603 onwards.
One more quickie.
That there's not an Irish name amongst all of these, and so was West Cork totally settled at that point by the English or
No.
pirates, or what had happened to the O'Donovans, the O'Sullivans, apart from Mr. O'Driscoll, who was obviously serving two masters, but what happened?
Well,
to all the
the
others?
O'Sullivans are still active down west. I didn't get into them. The O'Mahanys come back big time and basically almost burn out Hull in 1640 during the Cromwellian period. They're still there. There are Irish pirates. Patrick Maya and his pirate band in Crookhaven were Irish. They were merchants, basically. You have Lynches, you have Kellys, you have their lesser captains and lesser crew. So you do have them in the records. It's just that I haven't had time to go into them. But there were a lot of Irish serving there as well.
I think the lesson is we have to have Connie back next year for a whole other set of lectures. Just a quick housekeeping note. If you were here just for today or just for this session, we'd like to thank you so much for coming to West Cork History Festival. We hope it's the first of many and that you'll all be getting involved in lots of different ways in the years to come. If you're coming back tomorrow, thank you, and we'll see you then. And if we're going to dinner, hopefully it won't be too much of a pirate party, because that sounded quite violent. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.